centuries, Africa's riches fueled the world while its people remained poor. But now Ghana has struck minerals so rare, so valuable, they could change everything. Trillions buried beneath the soil. And this time the nation isn't letting it go. No more raw exports, no more silent theft. Ghana has a plan to take control, rewrite the rules, and shake the foundations of global power. Ghana's land has always been rich, but its people have never truly owned that richness. For centuries, the story repeated itself like a haunting drumbeat. Dig, export, and watch others grow rich. From the depths of gold mines to the veins of bauxite and manganese, foreign companies came with contracts and smiles and left with billions. What remained behind were poisoned rivers, unstable currencies, and communities stripped of dignity. But 2025 may be the year that story begins to end. It started not with a headline, but a quiet survey. A group of researchers from Ghana's University of Mines and Technology, working alongside partners from the University of Johannesburg, were mapping rock formations in southern Ghana's Kibwin Belt. What they found sent a tremor through the global resource industry. Huge quantities of tantalum embedded in ancient igneous rock. Tantalum isn't just another metal, it's the silent backbone of modern life. Inside every smartphone, electric vehicle, and advanced medical device, there's a sliver of tantalum keeping it alive. It handles heat like no other, stores power efficiently, and resists corrosion under extreme conditions. It's not flashy, but it's priceless. As the world races to power green technologies, the demand for metals like tantalum is exploding. Countries with the mineral hold keys to the future, and now Ghana holds those keys. But the tantalum discovery was just the beginning. Hundreds of kilometers away, in the OT region's rugged terrain, another exploration was underway. The Ghana Integrated Iron and Steel Development Corporation was drilling for iron ore in the Jamaru mountain range. What they found instead was another shock: nickel. Not in traces, but in commercially viable quantities. Nickel is the lifeblood of electric vehicle batteries. The higher the nickel content, the longer the range and the better the performance. With global demand skyrocketing, every tech company, every automaker, and every battery supplier is scrambling for access. And Ghana, by sheer geological luck and strategic planning, now holds two of the world's most strategic minerals. This double discovery, tantalum and nickel, is more than just geological fortune. It is a test of whether a resource-rich African nation can finally break the curse of extraction, whether it can resist the global machinery that has always turned Africa's wealth into someone else's profit. The response from Ghana's government has been swift and uncharacteristically bold. Gone are the days of silent compliance. The Ghanaian leadership, backed by a population tired of watching fortunes flow outward, is now rewriting the playbook. This is not about closing doors. It's about changing the locks. The goal is not just to extract minerals, but to process them at home, to build industries, to create jobs, to add value before a single ounce leaves the country. Tantalum won't be sold raw. It will be used to make components. Nickel won't vanish into cargo ships. It will become battery-grade material right on Ghanaian soil. This strategy has a name: resource nationalism. And Ghana isn't hiding from it. It is embracing it, broadcasting it, and daring the world to respond. Because for the first time in a long time, Ghana isn't asking to be included. It's demanding to lead. As news of the mineral discovery spread, so did the tension. Global commodity markets reacted with barely concealed urgency. Suddenly, executives in London, Frankfurt, and Washington began taking meetings about Ghana, meetings they hadn't bothered to schedule in decades. Because Ghana, once seen as just another exporter of raw goods, had declared its intention to break free from the old colonial trade patterns. No more one-sided contracts. No more secretive concessions. No more foreign multinationals writing the rules in Accra boardrooms. This time, Ghana would negotiate from a position of strength, with leverage rooted not just in resources, but in resolve. That resolve came from pain. Generations of missed opportunities, of seeing gold and cocoa shipped abroad while schools lacked chalk and clinics lacked electricity. It came from the frustrations of a young generation that had watched their parents work hard, while the fruits of their land disappeared into ports they'd never see. And it came from leadership finally willing to say, enough. At the center of this shift is the Ghana Minerals Investment Initiative, a government-led platform designed to ensure that any new mining agreements are transparent, equitable, and structured to retain value within the country. Companies must now meet strict requirements for local content, technology transfer, and environmental protection. More importantly, they must commit to downstream processing. No more extracting and leaving. This is a radical departure from the past, when governments desperate for foreign capital would sign almost anything to keep investors from leaving. But Ghana is no longer desperate. With tantalum and nickel in hand, it is now being courted by everyone, from American tech giants to Chinese state-owned mining groups. But courting doesn't mean control. The message from Accra is clear. Ghana will partner, but it will not beg. Those days are over. The response has been mixed. Some corporations have expressed willingness to adapt, to set up local refining plants, to employ Ghanaian engineers, to follow the new rules. Others have warned of investment risk, a familiar phrase used whenever African nations assert themselves. And behind those words lies a threat. If you don't play our game, we'll leave. But Ghana's leadership seems unmoved. They've seen what investment brought in the past. Communities displaced, lands poisoned, and profits exported. Now they want something different, something fair. And they are betting that the world needs these minerals badly enough to accept the new terms. It's a bold wager, but it's backed by more than just policy. It's backed by people. Across the country, civic organizations, university researchers, youth groups, and traditional leaders have all rallied behind the government's stance. They know that what's at stake is not just economic opportunity, but national destiny. For Ghana, this is about dignity. It's about never again allowing the world to treat its soil as a warehouse and its people as an afterthought. The tantalum and nickel discoveries may have sparked global interest, but they've ignited something deeper at home, a will to finally turn natural wealth into shared power. Whether that transformation succeeds will depend not only on government resolve, but on how far the country is willing to go when the pressure mounts. Because the pressure is coming. The pressure began quietly, as it always does, not with threats or tanks, but with analysts whispering into the ears of investors, with consultants releasing risk alerts about Ghana's business environment, with international media questioning the country's populist turn. Articles appeared in Western financial outlets suggesting Ghana was nationalizing its mining sector, a coded accusation designed to trigger fear in boardrooms and undermine confidence in the country's leadership. The pattern was familiar to those who had watched this happen elsewhere. When an African nation dares to assert ownership over its resources, the world responds not with applause, but with alarm. First comes the narrative shift, then the economic squeeze, reports of capital flight, downgrades from credit rating agencies, sudden delays in project funding, all of it cloaked in the language of concern for the investment climate, for regulatory uncertainty, for rule of law. But beneath those polite phrases lies a darker truth. The system is not neutral. It rewards obedience and punishes ambition. Ghana was now being punished for its ambition. Yet this time, something different happened. The government didn't backtrack. Instead, it dug in. President Nana Kwame Mensah, a leader not widely known outside Africa until recently, went on national television and spoke with a calm fire that gripped the nation. "We are not chasing trouble," he said. "We are chasing justice. If our wealth is valuable to others, then it must be valuable enough to transform the lives of our people. If that is wrong, then let the world judge us." The speech went viral. Not in the sanitized corridors of Washington or Brussels, but in the streets of Accra, in the classrooms of Kumasi, in the cocoa farms of the Volta region. People felt seen, heard, empowered. The old fear that demanding too much would make investors run began to dissolve. In its place came a bolder question. Why had we ever settled for so little? That shift in public consciousness became a political shield. It gave the government space to act, and act it did. The Ministry of Trade began fast-tracking licenses for local startups focused on battery technology. Tax incentives were introduced for companies building domestic refining plants. Universities received grants to expand geology and metallurgy programs. A National Minerals Innovation Fund was launched to help Ghanaian firms compete in the global supply chain, not as raw material suppliers, but as industrial players. Critics called it overreach. Supporters called it long overdue. And across the continent, other leaders began watching closely. In Zambia, in Tanzania, in the DRC, quiet discussions began to surface. If Ghana could stand up, why couldn't they? What started as a local discovery had become a regional question. And that's when the geopolitics intensified. Foreign embassies in Accra began requesting closed-door meetings. Concerns were raised. Offers were made, offers for partnerships, for funding, for infrastructure, but always with conditions. Conditions that sounded helpful but felt familiar. Ghana was being invited back into the fold, but only if it softened its stance. And once again, the country had a choice to make. Play the game or change it. And this time, it chose change. Ghana's decision to reject conditional deals from global powers sent ripples far beyond its own borders. It became a signal to the rest of the continent that the era of quiet compliance was breaking apart. And for those who had built their influence on Africa's passive participation, this was unacceptable. The diplomatic pressure intensified. Behind the scenes, multilateral banks began delaying loan disbursements. Western donor agencies suspended non-mining development projects without official explanation. International media coverage of Ghana started to shift, from hopeful economic narratives to stories about growing instability, economic populism, and rising authoritarianism. None of this was accidental. It was part of a familiar pattern of reputational sabotage, where self-assertion by African states is rebranded as recklessness and sovereignty is portrayed as a threat to order. But Ghana didn't flinch. Instead, it doubled its outreach, not to old allies, but to new ones. In a surprising turn, trade delegations were sent to Southeast Asia, South America, and even Central Asia. Meetings were held with Indonesian nickel processors, Brazilian mining engineers, and Indian tech manufacturers. Ghana wasn't just looking for buyers, it was looking for partners. Nations that had also lived through colonialism, extraction, and dependency, and had found ways to build beyond them. This pivot wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. It broke the illusion that Africa's future must always orbit Western institutions. And it proved that alternatives were not only possible, they were already alive in other parts of the world. While this new diplomacy unfolded, something equally powerful was happening at home. For the first time in recent history, mineral wealth became a topic of community dialogue. Town hall meetings were held in newly discovered mining regions. Chiefs, youth leaders, women's groups, and environmental activists were invited into the process, not just to observe, but to shape policy. Community benefit agreements became mandatory for any new extraction project. Local schools received new science labs funded directly from mineral royalties. Clinics were built where roads had never reached. The wealth that had once vanished into foreign accounts was now leaving footprints in Guinean soil. It wasn't perfect. There were still bureaucratic challenges, allegations of favoritism, and questions about long-term sustainability. But the difference was visible, and more importantly, it was felt. In mining towns, fathers who once begged for jobs in foreign-owned pits now applied for training in mineral processing. Mothers who had once watched their rivers turn brown now sat on committees deciding where royalties would be spent. And children, watching it all, began to see their country not as a victim, but as a player. This generational shift in self-perception was perhaps the most valuable mineral of all, because while resources can be depleted, dignity, once reclaimed, becomes a force that reshapes everything. And the international response? It became more desperate. Offers of military cooperation were floated. Intelligence sharing agreements were proposed, and even rumors of foreign-backed opposition funding began circulating. The message was clear. Ghana's independence was acceptable only if it remained symbolic. But now that it had become real, tied to power, to policy, and to prosperity, it was a threat. And threats in geopolitics are not tolerated quietly. The question facing Ghana was no longer whether it could stand. It was whether it could endure. Endurance would not come easy. By mid-2025, Ghana found itself at the crossroads every rising nation eventually reaches, the moment when bold ideas begin to face quiet sabotage. Local operatives funded by obscure international NGOs began organizing protests against environmental mismanagement and mining corruption. Headlines in major global outlets warned of a looming crisis in Ghana's mineral sector. Behind these stories were networks with histories of undermining nationalist projects in the global south. And though many of the concerns were legitimate about pollution, transparency, and accountability, the sudden amplification raised eyebrows. Why now? Why so loud? The answer, as always, lay in fear. Fear that Ghana's experiment might succeed. Fear that a resource-rich African nation might not just survive, but thrive outside the grip of donor dependency and foreign licensing. Fear that the idea of sovereignty, once dismissed as outdated, was proving to be dangerously contagious. In response, the Ghanaian government made a rare move. It opened its books. A nationwide digital transparency dashboard was launched, showing every mineral contract, royalty disbursement, and community benefit allocation in real time. A hotline was established for whistleblowers to report misuse of funds. Civil society groups were invited into oversight panels. The goal wasn't just to silence critics, it was to build a wall of truth that rumors couldn't climb. Meanwhile, the economic foundations of this movement were solidifying. Domestic banks began offering specialized financing for mineral processing startups. University engineering programs partnered with public sector labs to innovate extraction methods tailored to Ghana's unique geology. The first Tantalum refining plant opened near Obuasi, operated by a joint Ghanaian-Brazilian venture. Nickel pilot processing units were launched in the OT region, employing hundreds of young technicians. These weren't dreams on paper. They were realities being built brick by brick. But beneath the success lay the constant thrum of threat. Foreign intelligence services had started probing. Flights in and out of Ghana were monitored more closely. Trade routes were quietly evaluated by Western naval partners for strategic vulnerabilities. The country, while not at war, had entered a new kind of battlefield, one where weapons were contracts, narratives, and economic blackmail. Ghana responded with unity. National days of dialogue were held, where citizens across political lines discussed what kind of future they wanted. Artists released songs about resource dignity. Elders recorded oral histories linking the current movement to the anti-colonial struggles of the past. It became clear, this was no longer just about minerals. It was about memory, about reclaiming what had been taken, not just gold or land, but voice. President Mensah, in one of his most moving addresses, said, "We are not poor, we have been impoverished." That is not the same. Poverty is a condition. Impoverishment is a system, and systems can be dismantled. That speech was replayed across the continent, in cafes in Dakar, in radio stations in Lusaka, in universities in Nairobi. It sparked a dangerous thought. If Ghana can speak this way, why not us? And in that thought lay a quiet revolution. Not of weapons, but of will. And the world, which had always assumed Africa would ask before acting, was now watching a nation that no longer waited. As Ghana stepped further into this new role, no longer a compliant exporter, but a bold architect of its own destiny, the world's reactions grew more unpredictable. Some nations reached out with cautious admiration. Indonesia offered technical exchange programs in nickel processing. Brazil dispatched mineral experts to collaborate on sustainable extraction. Even South Korea expressed interest in establishing joint research facilities. But alongside these partnerships came whispers. Whispers of sabotage. Whispers of foreign agents seeking to destabilize Ghana's internal cohesion. Rumors that key officials were being targeted with bribes. That opposition parties were receiving hidden funding. That old colonial players were preparing new moves. Ghanaian intelligence didn't dismiss these rumors. They investigated. Quiet arrests were made. Foreign operatives were discreetly expelled. And yet, through it all, the government maintained a calm public face, not to hide the danger, but to show the nation it would not be intimidated. But the pressure did not only come from outside. Inside Ghana, fault lines began to show. Not everyone welcomed the government's assertive stance. Some business elites whose fortunes had been built on foreign contracts and low-regulation exports started voicing concern. Let's not scare away investors, they warned. Let's move slowly. But Ghana no longer had the patience for slow betrayal disguised as caution. The youth who had grown up watching their potential wasted rallied behind the new path. They demanded speed. They demanded transformation. They had waited long enough. In response, the government pushed further. A new Mineral Sovereignty Act was passed in Parliament, locking in key protections. All strategic minerals to be processed on Ghanaian soil, mandatory equity ownership for local communities, full environmental restoration requirements for every ton extracted. No exceptions. The bill passed with overwhelming support, but not without backlash. Western governments issued soft warnings about investment chill. Legal experts hinted that Ghana might be violating parts of international trade agreements. Some development loans were delayed. But again, Ghana stood firm, because by now the people were watching, closely, and they weren't just watching the government, they were watching the world. Watching who respected their decisions, who tried to manipulate them, who offered partnership, and who demanded submission. And that watching had consequences. In polling stations and public squares, in market stalls and bus stations, the people talked. Not about celebrities or gossip, but about contracts, policies, minerals, power. The national conversation had changed, and in that change, Ghana found something rare: political clarity. Not unity in every detail, but unity in direction. A direction that led away from begging and toward bargaining, away from handouts and toward ownership. And that clarity scared those who had once thrived in confusion. They responded with tactics, not overt invasion, but subtle invasion. Suddenly, Ghanaian tech infrastructure faced increased cyber attacks. Disinformation campaigns flooded social media, casting doubt on the mineral findings, spreading rumors of government theft, questioning the viability of new refineries. It was classic hybrid warfare. No guns, just ghosts in the machine. But Ghana had prepared. A national cyber defense unit had been quietly built months earlier. Countermeasures were activated, fake accounts traced, digital firewalls reinforced. Once again, the country refused to panic, because panic was what the old system wanted. A scared Ghana was an obedient Ghana. But this Ghana, this new Ghana, was awake, and it would not go back to sleep. By the time the world began to fully grasp the depth of Ghana's transformation, it was already too late to stop it. The country had crossed a threshold, from silent participant in global resource extraction to sovereign architect of its own mineral destiny. And the most extraordinary part was not just the minerals themselves, but what Ghana had built around them. A protective shell of legislation, civic awareness, international diversification, and internal resolve. This wasn't nationalism in the traditional sense. It wasn't isolationism or bravado. It was strategic dignity, a demand that Ghana's role in the world economy be defined by fairness, not favoritism. And that demand began to echo far beyond its borders. In Nairobi, student unions debated the Ghanaian model. In Kinshasa, opposition parties invoked it as a challenge to corrupt mining contracts. In Lusaka and Maputo, youth leaders circulated speeches by President Mensah, framing them as the modern equivalent of the anti-colonial manifestos of the 1960s. Ghana had unwittingly become a moral example, not of perfection, but of possibility. But with example came exposure, and exposure drew enemies. The global rare earth lobby, increasingly dependent on a fragile supply chain, began to treat Ghana as a geopolitical variable. Lobbyists in Brussels and Washington pushed for new legislation, labeling certain critical minerals as strategic security assets, a move that would allow Western states to block or redirect flows of Ghanaian tantalum and nickel under the guise of national interest. Legal scholars warned that such moves could spark diplomatic standoffs, and Ghana knew it. In a stunning address to the African Union, President Mensah warned against what he called resource neo-sovereignty, a new form of control where access to minerals was dictated not by markets or merit, but by imperial memory. He said, if our minerals are strategic to your future, then our freedom must be strategic to yours as well. The room erupted in applause, but the applause did not stop the moves behind the curtain. Western corporations began quietly negotiating with neighboring states to build bypass routes, railways, ports, storage facilities that would allow them to avoid Ghanaian control while still accessing regional deposits. In response, Ghana launched the Pan-African Minerals Corridor, a bold infrastructure proposal aimed at linking West Africa's mining regions under local control. Agreements were signed with Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, and even Guinea, creating a shared logistics and export system free from foreign gatekeeping. The message was clear: if they try to isolate us, we will integrate. But with every step forward came greater risk. Foreign intelligence agencies were caught surveilling Ghana's mineral ministry. An attempt was made to hack into the mineral sovereignty database. Suspicious fires broke out at 2 regional geological survey offices. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone understood the implication. Still, Ghana pressed forward. Mining revenues were transparently reinvested into education and healthcare. A sovereign mineral fund was launched, modeled after Norway's oil fund, to ensure that future generations would benefit from today's resources. Local ownership of processing plants rose from 3% to 29% in less than a year. These were not just numbers, they were structural shifts. But the real battle was still inside the nation's consciousness. Could it hold the line when the threats became unbearable? Could it stay united when the pressure fractured others? Could it keep believing that it was possible to win without submission? These questions hung heavy because the storm was still coming, and Ghana was now at its center. As Ghana braced itself for the storm, something even more powerful than minerals or policies began to take root. National discipline, not the kind imposed by force, but the kind born from shared awareness. Across the country, there was a rising sense that everyone was part of something fragile yet historic. Teachers began incorporating mineral sovereignty into school lessons. Radio hosts aired daily segments breaking down resource policies for ordinary listeners. Mosques and churches spoke of stewardship and responsibility in sermons. Ghana was not just managing its resources, it was cultivating a mindset, a national character aligned with self-determination. And in that mindset lay its greatest defense. But those who had long profited from Ghana's dependence were not sitting idle. Global lobbying networks began framing the country's actions as economic nationalism run amok. Investor conferences quietly removed Ghana from their agendas. Media think pieces shifted tone from curiosity to concern, then from concern to condemnation. Will Ghana's mineral power destabilize West Africa? One headline asked. Is Accra endangering global supply chains? Asked another. These were not innocent questions. They were trial balloons for a narrative Ghana knew too well. That any African state that acts outside the script is not sovereign. It is dangerous. And so the isolation widened. Credit agencies downgraded Ghana's ratings. Shipping insurance premiums were raised for cargo leaving West African ports. Even foreign universities pulled out of academic exchange programs. But inside the country, the fear began to transform. It didn't disappear, but it hardened into resolve. Farmers in Ashanti began forming cooperatives to supply food to mining communities, cutting dependency on imported goods. Engineers in Tamale volunteered to train rural youth on electrical systems to power small-scale mineral processing plants. Artists in Accra painted murals of miners shaking hands with scientists under the words, "Our land, our mines, our future." This wasn't propaganda, it was participation. And the government didn't suppress it, it celebrated it. National holidays were redesigned to honor not just past independence, but current resistance. Public monuments were commissioned to commemorate the resource revolution. Ghana was scripting its identity not through struggle alone, but through design. The West, perplexed by the country's continued rise despite pressure, quietly began seeking new openings. Offers returned, but this time, rebranded as cooperation, climate support, technology exchange. But Ghana had learned, the people had learned, the danger was no longer in saying no, it was in saying yes too quickly, without memory. President Mensah made it clear, "We welcome all who come in good faith, but we no longer sign agreements we did not help draft. We no longer accept futures we did not imagine." And that posture became the new diplomacy. Ghana was no longer reactive, it was assertive. And that shift changed everything. African diplomats began quoting Ghana's policies at continental forums. AU commissions studied its Mineral Sovereignty Act as a potential template. Pan-African investors launched funds focused solely on intra-African resource ventures. Ghana, without asking, had become a leader. Not of slogans, but of systems. Not of defiance alone, but of direction. And that leadership, though inspiring, came with shadows. Sabotage remained a risk. Division remained a threat. But the country had now passed through fire. And those who emerged from fire no longer fear the heat. Ghana had not escaped the storm. It had become the eye of it. And in that stillness, surrounded by pressure, it found its strength. Ghana's story is no longer just a national journey. It is a continental signal, a quiet revolution wrapped in laws, policies, and collective awakening. And in that signal lies a truth too uncomfortable for many to accept, that a nation once defined by exports and dependency has become a symbol of resistance, responsibility, and reconstruction. Not because it discovered minerals, but because it dared to own them, not just physically, but politically and spiritually. The minerals were always there, buried for centuries, waiting. What changed was not the soil, it was the soul. A generation tired of watching their land enrich others finally said no. And more than that, they said yes to something different, to a path filled with risk but paved with dignity. The world expected Ghana to fail, to collapse under its own ambition, to retreat when faced with sanctions, sabotage, and smears. But it didn't. And in not failing, it exposed a weakness in the global order itself, a system built on the assumption that Africa would never rise unless someone else lifted it. Ghana didn't ask to be lifted. It stood, and in standing, it shook the room. It reminded those who thought history had ended that history in Africa was just beginning again. President Mensah, standing before a packed stadium on Ghana's Independence Day, said it best. We have been called the Gold Coast, the Cocoa Land, the Friendly Gateway. But today we claim a new name. We are the architects of our own wealth, and we will build it with our hands, guard it with our lasos, and protect it with our lives. The crowd didn't cheer. They roared. It was the roar of centuries silenced, finally breaking free. Elders wept. Children stood tall. For the first time in living memory, the minerals beneath their feet no longer felt cursed. They felt earned. Not given, not stolen, not borrowed. Earned. The story of Ghana's mineral revolution will not end here. There will be trials. Elections will test the system. Markets will shift. Foreign powers will continue to pressure and probe. But something irreversible has already happened. Belief. A nation now believes it deserves more than survival. It deserves prosperity on its own terms. That belief cannot be assassinated. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be erased by headlines. It lives in the factories being built by Ghanaian engineers. It lives in the new textbooks that teach children about nickel and tantalum not as exports, but as opportunities. It lives in the quiet pride of a farmer who knows that the wealth of her land is finally being kept home. And so, as the world debates and the powers maneuver, Ghana walks forward, not loudly, not recklessly, but deliberately, eyes open, head high, because this time it knows the truth. The ground beneath its feet has always been rich, but now so are its people, and that is the most dangerous discovery of all.